Hello everyone and welcome to Beginner's Code. Today we are going to be using HTML, CSS and JavaScript to create a color palette generator that updates on click to show different colors and their hex values. So the first thing we want to do is just create three files. The first will be an index.html file, then we'll have a main.css file and a main.js file. Now the HTML file will use the boilerplate HTML5, and then we will change the title to say color palette generator, and then we will just link the main.css, so main.css, and then inside the body we want to have a background, so we'll say div.card. And then inside of this, we'll need something for the header, so div.header. And then we'll have a heading here, which will be a h1 tag, which will have the ID of heading. And it will just say color palette generator. And then we'll have a button, which has the ID of random button using camel case. And then it also has an on-click element. So here we'll just say on-click is equal to change palette, and we'll pass in the parentheses so we are calling it whenever the button has been clicked. And then we'll just say click here to randomize, and then we'll save. And now underneath this, so outside of the header card, or the header div, sorry, we will have a new div that will say div.palettes. So we'll have a class of palettes. And then inside of here, we'll have the first div, which will have the ID of 1. And then inside of that, we'll have the heading 1, which has an ID of 1 head. And then we need to do this 4 times. So we'll have 5 times, sorry. So we'll have div2 with heading 1 of ID 2 head, and then div 3 with the heading 1 of 3 head, div 4, and then finally div 5. Now if we save this and then open it with Google Chrome, so we now have a button with a title, and if we inspect it, we also have the palettes divs here, which don't have any content, but we can still see them actually in our HTML. So the next thing we want to do is just give it some styling. And what we actually want to pass in is a font. So if we go to Google and we go to Google Fonts, and then we search for Roboto, and we'll just take the regular 400. So if we import it, we can just select this and paste it into our HTML file, no, it's our CSS file. And then we can also take this, as this will be what we'll be using for our font family. So as we have this, we can take the body tag and just pass it in here, and that will allow it to be given to every single element inside of our HTML file. So now we'll target the palettes, and we'll just use display equal to flex, and we'll say justify content to be center, and then align items to be center, and we'll pass in flex direction of row. So now if we come back to here and refresh, we have a change of color, a change of font. So now if we come back to here, we can now start adjusting our actual divs that represent the color palettes. So we'll have 1, 2, 3, 4, and then 5. And inside of here, we just want to change the height to be 600 pixels, the width to be 18%, so that will be 18% of the total palette's width. So one will be 18%, two of them together will be 36, etc. And then we'll change the display to also be flex, but with the justify content to be at the center, and then the align items we want to be flex end. So this will be at the very bottom if we have it as a column, or the very far right hand side if we have it as a row. So now we can adjust the headings for each one. So 1 head, 2 head, 3, 4, and then 5. And here we just want to change the font size to be 10 pixels. And then the margin bottom to be 40 pixels. So if we save that and then come back here, we won't actually see any change, because what will be happening in the back end in terms of the JavaScript will be affecting what we're seeing right now. So if I start changing the JavaScript so that we can actually see some of this, so what we'll have is function, and we'll say create color. And then inside of this function, we'll create a variable called hex codes, which will take in a list of strings. So the first 9 elements will be the numbers through 1 to 9, as they will represent the numbers that we can use in a hex code. So we have 1 to 9, and then we have A, capital B, capital C, capital D, capital E, and capital F. So next we'll have var hex, and that will just be equal to a list that has one element and it's a hashtag. So now we can create a for loop. So for let I equals 0, and then we'll say I is less than 6, and we'll just increment I. So now we'll do var num is equal to math.floor, and then math.random times by 11, and that will pick a random number between 0 and 10. 0 and 1, and we'll times it by 11, and this will give us a random number from this list of hex codes. So now we can then do hex plus equals hex codes at the index of num. So we'll be taking this list here, finding the num index. So if we have index 4, then we go 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and we pass in the value of 5 to this list. So the list would then look like that. So now outside of this for loop, we can then create the new variable called hex code, and this will be equal to hex.toString, and then we will just return the hex code at the end. So we should receive a 7-character string that starts with a hashtag and then has 6 preceding characters. So the next thing that we want to do is just create another function, and this will be the change palette. And then inside of this function, we just want to take a couple of things. So we'll create a new variable called codes, and that will be an empty list. And then we'll grab a couple of elements from the HTML file, from the actual DOM. So we'll say let first div equal document.get element by ID, and this will just say 1. And then I'm going to copy and paste this so that we have 5, and we'll say second div, third div, fourth div, and then fifth div. And this will have 2, 3, 4, and 5. So now we can actually create a new variable called divs, which will just take in the elements that we've just, or the variables that we've just created that are storing the index.html files, or index.html tags. So here we're grabbing the one tag and we're storing it inside this div. So we can then have the second div, the third div, the fourth div, and then the fifth div. And now we can use another for loop, and we'll say for let I equals 0, I is less than 5, and then I++, and then we will just create another variable called hex code is equal to create color. So we'll call this function here inside of this function every loop iteration, and we'll store it inside of this new variable called hex code. Next we'll use codes.push, and we will pass in the hex code. So this will just append the hex code value to this code. And then we'll say document I actually think this should be outside of the for loop. So document.get element by ID, and we'll pass in using backticks a string literal. So we'll pass in a $, curly braces, and then we'll say divs at the value of I, and then .id. So this is actually meant to be inside of the for loop. So now what we're doing is we're going through the divs, each div element, or this div here, we're finding the index value I. So on the first iteration it will be 0, so we'll be using this first div element here, and we'll get the ID of it, which will be the value of 1. And then we'll say .style .background color, and we'll set that equal to codes and then I. So on the same iteration through with the value of 0, we will have a value added here to the hex codes, well, to the codes, and this value will be created in the middle of the iteration. And then we will be styling that's just been added to the codes with this, well, inside of this div here. So after this, we will then use document.get element by ID, and again we'll pass in the backticks, $, curly braces, and we'll say divs at the index of I, and we'll say .id, and then outside of this curly brackets but still inside of the string, we'll pass in head, and this will represent the heading 1 information, so the ID of 1 head, and then 2 head, 3 head. So now outside of this we can change the text content to be equal to, and then a backtick, $, curly braces, and we'll say codes at I. So now if we save this and then head back over to here and run, when we click this, we should have some kind of change. Give me 2 seconds and I'll have a look why. Okay, so after looking through pretty much every single line of code, I realized that I forgot to add in the script file. So we'll just pass in the script tag with the source to main.js. Now if we save it and just make sure we have everything else saved, and we come back to here, we press the click here to randomize, we now have 5 different divs, all generating a different color, and they each have the color code that represents each one. So you can easily just copy and paste that and put it into wherever you need to. So now if we come back to our main.css file, we are going to want to actually start targeting some specific things. So if we have a look at the header, we can then change the display to flex, change the justify content to center, and then align items to center. And then we'll change flex direction to column, and then margin top, we'll just say, bottom, we'll just say to 40 pixels. So if we come back to here and refresh, we now have this back in the center. And if we click here, we actually have a margin between them, whereas before this was pushed right up to the button. So now we have the heading sorted, we can change the random button. So the actual button, we gave it an ID of a random button. So here we'll just say border of none, and then border bottom, we will make 1 pixel solid and give an RGB value of 8, 59, and then 77. And we'll just say outline will be none, width will be 20%, so 20% of its parent header, or parent node, which will be the header. And then we will change the background to be the value of white, FFF, and then we'll say color will just pass into the black, and then font dash family, we will pass in Roboto and also sans serif. And then we will give the letter spacing a little bit more room, so 0.1 em, which will just give it a little bit added extra, a nice little bit of styling. And now we just need to get the divs moving that way. So if we come back to palettes, change this to column. Change this to row, which is what it should have been on. Okay, so one thing that I've just realized about the palettes is we actually gave it a class. So if I change that to a full stop, if we just come to the index.html file and just double check, we have div of class palettes. So now if we save this and then come back to our color palette generator, and if we refresh and press click here to randomize, we now have 5 blocks that all work alongside each other, which looks much better. We can now actually change this so we can make it a little bit bigger. So if we just come back to our here, we'll say font size, instead of 10 pixels we will make it 20 pixels, and then we'll refresh, click here to randomize. We now have the actual codes that are much more readable, and we can just continue to randomize different colors. Thanks for watching. Hopefully this has helped your understanding of how we can use HTML, CSS and JavaScript to make our websites more instant and interactive without having to refresh pages. If you liked what we've been through and you want to learn more, please drop a like and subscribe to my channel to keep up to date. Don't forget to stay tuned, ready for the first release of my free 30 Days of Python guide.